everybody. We're glad that you could make it on this snowy afternoon. I want to welcome you to our newly refocused and organized Mansfield Dialogues. This is the first one of our spring 2019 dialogue series, and the theme for the spring is Challenges to a Peaceful World. So we hope that you can make it to our future dialogues and meetings that will be happening throughout the semester. And we just would like you to be aware that MCAT will be filming this as part of a media accessibility event, and a recording of this will be available at a later date. And with that, I'll turn the time over to Dr. Owen.
Thank you all for coming today. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today. And I just wanted to say that as a professor of Russian language and culture and at the former Soviet Union, I can say that we really are honored today to have such a distinguished speaker here in our community. Juris Doctorate, Julie Sirs, has a very impressive education and a wealth of professional experiences that I wanted to share with you. From my research on the internet, I found so much. She has 4 degrees. So as an undergraduate, she attended Georgetown University and attended the School of Foreign Service there. And after that, she obtained a Master's of Education from George Mason University, followed by a JD from the University of Montana here at law school, followed by a Master of Laws at the University of Washington Law School. And Ms. Sirs has worked as an intelligence officer with the Defense Intelligence Agency, also as an attorney researching potential cases involving Russian cyber attacks, and is co-founder of Montanans for National Security. Her years in the profession have also included several trips to Afghanistan, as well as the publication of an edited volume on terrorist activity. So please join me in welcoming Julie Sirs.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you everyone who came out today. It's certainly a day I think all of us might be more inclined to be curled up at home or in an office somewhere, so thanks for braving the weather and coming out. For some of you who are political junkies, of whom I count myself one, tearing yourself away from the Cohen testimony in front of Congress today is also a sacrifice of sorts, so hopefully we can all catch up with that after this. Before I start, let me just mention sort of along those lines, I imagine particularly for those of you who are here today interested in this subject, you probably know already something about this topic of Russia's role in the digital world. So I'm going to try not to cover too much ground that I think you probably already know, particularly about Russia's involvement, or fairly well-known involvement digitally, in a sense, in the United States, but instead I'm going to look at some of the breadth of that involvement elsewhere in the world, and then also more in depth on some of the issues particularly that affect the United States and that have received probably less coverage than some of the better-known examples. I should say, too, when I refer generally to Russia, I'm going to be referring to, for the most part, sort of official Russia, and to the extent that I say anything that might seem disparaging about Russia or Russians, I'm specific to those who are engaging in these actions, not at all toward the Russian people, for whom I actually have quite a bit of sympathy. And also, when I refer to digital, I'll be using that somewhat interchangeably, primarily with cyber activities. Digital, I think, and will come up from time to time, also referring sort of to cell phones and that sort of technology, too. And I'm hoping to have a good amount of time, hopefully at least about 15 minutes or so at the end for questions. If anyone has a burning question while I'm speaking, feel free to ask it. I'm certainly open to that as well. But first, I'd like to start us off with sort of a story, because I think one thing that's difficult about really wrapping our heads around whether it's Russia's involvement in the digital world or anyone's involvement is is what are sort of the physical world repercussions of some of this activity. I feel that we often don't take it seriously enough, partly because I think for many of us, and I include myself in this category, are really just learning about it more fully, I think particularly because of the events that happened in the U.S. in 2016, where some of us are still playing some catch-up on this. But I feel even as we start to wrap our heads around this, that the physical world implications or the seriousness of the cyber digital activity tends to be discounted. And so the story I want to relate is one that very much did have some physical world repercussions, and I think is a good way to lead us into this discussion more broadly of cyber digital activities. So I imagine everyone here has heard of the terrorist group ISIS or the Islamic State. I'm curious if you could maybe just show me a brief show of hands. How many have heard of a group called the Cyber Caliphate? Ring any bells? Okay, good. Yeah, and I think I, even at the time, vaguely remember hearing about it. They were better known starting in about 2014, 2015 for being presumed to be kind of the cyber arm of the Islamic State, or ISIS. And particularly in January 2015, they received some notoriety for hacking U.S. Department of Defense computers, releasing some of that hacked information online. In response to that hacking attack, a number of individuals were interviewed, including some spouses of U.S. active duty service personnel, and they said sort of the sorts of things that people typically do in those sorts of attack situations, saying, terrorists aren't going to frighten us. Yes, they can hack into our computers, but we're going to stand strong. And then about a month later, right around Valentine's Day, 5 of those military spouses who had been interviewed somewhat prominently related to the Cyber Caliphate attack in January 2015 themselves received death threats on social media, even directed toward their names individually. So, would say, Dear Angela, Happy Valentine's Day, something to that effect they actually referenced. We know everything about you, your husband and children. We're closer than you think. We're coming for you. And so the women who received this thought, oh my gosh, these terrorists are targeting me personally. Maybe they're not just in the Middle East. What's happening, what's going on here? And the very real world repercussions of this is that some of these spouses moved out of their homes for a time. They had discussions with their children's school about increasing security. The military increased some patrols and bases. And there was actually, in August of that year, a drone strike in Syria that is believed to have killed someone who was believed to have been one of these Cyber Caliphate hackers. And as part of this, too, I can't really remember now exactly, but while the January hack got a lot of attention, these February threats particularly did, because they caused a lot of people to believe that maybe ISIS had some assets here in the United States that were going to strike military families. There was, kind of that, as we often see in these sorts of attacks, these, ginning up of fears of radical Islamist terrorism and that sort of thing, and it's in the United States, all that we're kind of used to when we see these sorts of attacks. But it turns out it was not ISIS at all. These death threats and the whole Cyber Caliphate threat were actually Russian military intelligence. And that gradually became known among the sort of cybersecurity world as the Cyber Caliphate was conducting other attacks that were easier to trace in some ways, and yet in a way that the damage or the purpose of this attack from Russian military intelligence, GRU, was already achieved, in that it increased this fear of the Islamic threat in many ways. And curiously enough, I heard about this story. I did not know about the fact that the GRU was really the Cyber Caliphate, or the Cyber Caliphate was really the GRU. until I was talking to a reporter just last year who was covering this story, and it turns out he was actually the one who told these military spouses that, hey, just so you know, it wasn't ISIS that was threatening you, it was Russian military intelligence. And yet, we're not really doing anything about that. I certainly don't think most Americans realize that the GRU has reached out and personally sent death threats to other American citizens. And so that's kind of, I think, in some ways typical of this threat or Russia's role in the digital world that we're dealing with now. And targeting military families certainly is not unusual, or targeting military, U.S. military in general is certainly not unusual for the GRU, or I should say Russian intelligence in general. Whereas in sort of the pre-digital world, you might have a situation where Russia would try to, or Russian intelligence officers would try to recruit someone potentially as an asset by maybe going to a bar where U.S. servicemen would hang out and trying to establish a relationship. Now it can be as simple as a Facebook friend request from a seemingly attractive individual who might not even be the person who's actually sort of manipulating that digital image. We see a lot more now, again, just because of the nature of the change in technology, that whereas propaganda in years gone by was typically limited to print publications, maybe some TV, now you can get these fake social media accounts that will go into chat rooms where military members frequently communicate and pose as completely non-Russian individuals, but gradually sort of introduce these themes that are very sort of pro-Putin, anti-Ukraine, pro-Syria's dictator Assad, to much more subtly try to change the viewpoints of particularly American military members, but it can happen throughout society. There's a curious case of a publication called Veterans Today, which is an online publication that was started in about 2003, appears to have been sort of genuine, homegrown here in the United States, a publication geared toward veterans, as the name would suggest, and opposed to, as many Americans were starting to feel at the time, opposed to American involvement in the Iraq War. But over time, somehow, this publication seems to now, has established relationships with Russian state-related media organizations to filter in, again, this viewpoint that most Americans wouldn't suspect, especially most American veterans, if they're reading something called Veterans Today. And it combines that sort of information with services that veterans might really be seeking that are non-political, like job information, healthcare information, that sort of thing. So that's kind of the side of Russian involvement with the U.S. military that's in a sense changing what was nevertheless kind of a longer-standing purpose in terms of propaganda or disinformation or changing hearts and minds, in a sense. But of course, there's also the more threatening side. Now, digitally, it's easier for, say, a cell phone tower to be hacked, and if American forces are deployed overseas, say, in a NATO exercise, messages can be sent directly to their cell phones, threatening them and letting them know that the Russians, in a sense, are watching, with the idea to undermine morale, to help make them feel less secure in what they're doing. Like I mentioned with the cyber caliphate, there are just straightforward hacks of information that then can be published, sometimes harmful to individuals, but again, this sense of undermining a feeling of security. And so these kind of dual purposes, both the disinformation and then the potential acquisition of compromising material or leading people to compromising situations, is usually referred to in a Russian intelligence context as active measures. And so I will use that term from time to time throughout this presentation, and that's what I mean, kind of the two sides of these efforts. As part of the breadth that I wanted to provide in this presentation, I wanted to look beyond just American targets of Russian active measures and look kind of at the start of Russia's role in the digital world at least in the sense of sort of a more harmful activity. And the place most people usually start in looking at, again, sort of the real-world consequences of cyber activity starts with Estonia. And I think, ironically enough, given some of the issues that Americans have with emotions running high over statues, this incident started over a statue in Estonia, too. And it was basically where there was this monument to the Red Army as a liberator of the Estonians at the end of World War II, which many ethnic Estonians did not agree with that viewpoint, felt the Red Army was more an occupier at the end of World War II. But for ethnic Russians who were living in Estonia, they felt differently. So it was one of these, like we see in our own society, one of these sort of hot-button issues where emotions run high on both sides. The Estonian government wanted to move it to a less prominent location, and that in part ginned up by Russian media fake news stories that the statue was going to be destroyed, and other news stories designed to keep emotions running high helped to lead to several days of demonstrations. One person was even killed. But what this period is especially known for is it seems to have been the first known sort of nationwide attack where a country's communication systems were widely targeted, broadly understood now to be from Russia, even though Russia's never officially claimed responsibility for this. But what happened basically is what's known as a distributed denial of service attack, where communication servers get overwhelmed basically with just spam, but at about 1,000 times the rate of the information these servers usually have to deal with, and they just get overwhelmed and they can't send the messages on as they typically do. And so this affects, in this case and most others, if it's this broad, everything from government communications, financial institutions, media reports. Just think about all that, the way you interact with computers every day, or cell phone service, and how profoundly that can impact if suddenly those communication systems went down. And that's what happened in Estonia for about 10 days. Like I said, Russia has never officially taken responsibility for this, but both Estonian researchers who were at the time trying to stop these attacks, and then others from outside who came to assist, found that Russian IP addresses, in other words, internet identifiers, found some accounts linked actually to official Russian government accounts. There were instructions found online in Russian. The Estonian government had actually asked Moscow for assistance during this time and were refused. So it's pretty broadly considered to have been a Russian-sponsored attack, and yet, without Russia admitting it, or without the sort of clear-cut proof that you can see in other examples, harder to, for example, in Estonia's case, invoke Article 5 of NATO, which might have caused other countries to come, more affirmatively, or perhaps in a more conventional sense, to Estonia's aid. So it makes it difficult, as again we see ourselves when it happens in the United States, to really effectively target or counteract what the responsible party is doing. A couple of other similar examples, particularly in these former Soviet republics. In Georgia in 2008, that's believed to be the first sort of combined cyber attack with a more conventional military invasion, and that was again with Russia, and again sort of collapsing Georgia's communications, which you can imagine if you're being invaded, it would be helpful to be able to talk with other people in the government and military, so greatly complicating the situation for Georgia in that sense. For Ukraine, Ukraine could probably be, I think, a subject of an hour-long talk itself, and what it's had to deal with in terms of Russia's digital operations against it. Some of the main ones more recently were in 2014 a hack of Ukraine's election system, and it wasn't just their election commission, but it was sort of a three-part attack. So it sort of took down their the Ukraine Election Commission, making it very difficult for them to even hold the elections. This is about 3 days before the elections in 2014. The Ukrainians were able to bring that back up just a day before the election. But then, as a result of that, already starting to undermine the faith that people would have in the results. And that's a big part of the goal of a lot of these Russian operations, is even if it doesn't permanently disable whether it's communications or an election system, the increased sense of vulnerability that people have, the doubt that they have, knowing that an outsider can go into their systems and do something, is part of what's achieved for Russia in these operations. In 2014, there was, similar to what happened with Georgia, a coordinated cyber attack when Russia, in a conventional sense, invaded Crimea. In 2015 and 2016, attacks on Ukrainian power stations that caused the power stations to be disabled, and I should say this was in December of both years, so the coldest, darkest time when people most need power. And in 2017, some of you might be familiar with the NotPetya virus, that it was primarily targeting Ukraine, but just because of the nature of these sorts of malware viruses, spread just around the world in a number of places, including in the United States. So all of these sorts of activities, again, on a more temporary basis, disruptive, but in a longer-term sense, more profoundly disruptive in the sense of people not feeling that they have the security that they once thought that they did. Moving westward and to some other events that you all might be even more familiar with, we know now that the Brexit campaign earlier in 2016 than our presidential elections had significant Russian social media involvement. I think it's estimated that about 250,000 fake Russian social media accounts were pushing for the Leave campaign as part of Russia's effort to undermine the European Union and to encourage Great Britain to leave the EU. Some accounts once they were finally identified, were found to have been an overlap of the same accounts that were active in 2016 in our presidential election period, so kind of dual tasking, both encouraging Brexit and then doing what they were doing toward our electorate in 2016 as well. And I think, as we are still investigating what fully happened in 2016 with Russian involvement in our election, so too are the British trying to figure out fully what happened, and there are some of the same names, some of the same organizations that are coming through. I have a feeling there's still more to be learned, with a lot of overlap between those two efforts in 2016. The French elections, fortunately, in 2017 are more of a bright spot in part because the French could see what had happened in the United States and with Brexit to some extent too, were more on guard in terms of being able to identify what the Russians were doing. One of the key aspects of what Russia was trying to do with the French elections, similar to what happened to us in 2016, was a hack of the leading candidate, Emmanuel Macron, in that situation. And then a release of those hacked documents meant to disparage him or cause people to turn away from him in some sense. But again, partly because the French had seen, had a better sense of what was happening with that, but also because the release of those documents were timed just before the French, unlike us, go into sort of a 2-day media silence period right before the elections. It had a more limited impact in France, and even though that media silence doesn't apply to non-French media, and so presumably individuals could have gotten information that way, there seems to have been, I think, more of a respect or an acknowledgement of not to be persuaded by what was released in those documents. Also, there appears to have been some fake documents inserted into the real ones that were released as a result of the hack, and so again, it made people doubt, what were they really seeing, what was really real to begin with. So, just somewhat briefly, because I don't think any presentation on this subject would be complete if we didn't touch on what did happen to the United States in 2016. But we know, for example, again, Russian-sponsored a hacking of the computer systems of both major political parties, but only a release of the hacked materials related to Hillary Clinton's candidacy, both her directly and then also that of her campaign chairman. And it was really sort of a two-pronged effort, like I was just saying about Brexit, where it seems to have been more primarily just social media focused, and with the French election more on this sort of hack and release. In the United States example, we had both simultaneously or ongoing at the same time. Also interesting, as we're learning more, to see kind of these dual sides of Russia's role. We have what we know of in terms of what I'd call official Russia's role through its through its intelligence agencies, particularly the GRU, but then also this sort of plausible deniability aspect of particularly some of the social media operations being through, in particular, the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg. That's a photo of it. I think at the time, I don't know if anyone caught the Washington Post article yesterday. Apparently they've moved into a much brighter, bigger, shinier building now, but that's where they used to be housed. But allowing this sort of plausible deniability to some extent, where Putin could just say, we as a government weren't involved, that was just a private effort, even to the extent that that much is admitted. But again, in terms of how we were attacked, kind of coming at us from both these official and unofficial sides. What really struck me in reading some of the indictments that have come out of the Special Counsel's office detailing some of these Russian operations is the idea that, and getting back to the theme of the cyber world can also very much be the physical world, in that even though this was primarily a digital campaign on a number of different levels, you had Russians actually traveling to the United States, paying American citizens to organize and host political events on the ground, which strikes me as a very risky part of their operation, and in the greater scheme of things, probably that element of it not even that effective. So very curious, though, that they'd be willing to even take that step to actually send Russians to come into the United States. And then also, as part of all of these operations, also in the process committing, just fairly standard crimes like identity theft, wire fraud, money laundering, also very much a part of these operations. So I've mentioned the GRU a few times. I thought it would be a good idea in terms of going into a little more in depth with them, because they seem, even from within the Russian intelligence perspective, to be sort of the lead agency. A lot of you probably know that during the Soviet period, we usually think of Russian intelligence as being represented by the KGB. And the KGB now is really two different agencies, the SVR, which is more foreign-focused, and then the FSB that's more domestically prevalent. But the GRU, for those of us who don't like to learn new acronyms, fortunately stayed the same from the Soviet period to now, and it's Russian Military Intelligence. GRU stands for, is the acronym for the words in Russian for Main Intelligence Directorate. A number of sort of cybersecurity personnel, as they've been investigating some of these hacks and related incidents, have coined a number of nicknames, which they often give the hackers even before they ultimately figure out who it is. So you'll see, and this came about particularly in some of these American examples, some of the cybersecurity firms were nicknaming the GRU as Fancy Bear, whereas the SVR, that was also involved to a more limited extent were nicknamed Cozy Bear. So you'll see a lot of these names interchangeably, but it's in the GRU case the same. So the GRU was the only Russian intelligence organization, at least as far as we know at this time, that was involved in both of the two major hackings, both the DNC, where Clinton's documents were targeted, and then the DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign, where Podesta's documents were the main target. And like I was saying before, in general, they committed just kind of more standard, typical crimes in the course of this. One of the things that they did that surprised me when I read about it is, many of you may know that one of the Democratic Party's main sort of donation apps that you click on is ActBlue, and that was on, I think, some of these websites for these organizations. The GRU actually sort of reconfigured it for a time so that if you were a citizen wanting to donate to the Democratic Party during this 2016 period and you clicked on ActBlue, you were actually providing your credit card and other information directly to the GRU. And it's not clear to me, did your donation go to them too? I mean, it was just sort of a passing reference in one of these special counsel indictments that I think bears a lot more digging. But again, fascinating at kind of just the depth that they got into in the process of this larger campaign. Money laundering, stolen identities were true with these GRU hacking operations, as well as some of the social media activity as well. And also curious, the GRU seemed to be big fans of using Bitcoin for its presumed anonymity, and yet something must have gone wrong in their efforts, because some of the very specific transactions and the code for those also appeared in some of the special counsel affidavits, indictments. So that is part of the way that has been traced as well. Also, again, kind of like this plausible deniability or efforts to appear that way that you see with the Internet Research Agency not being an official Russian government organization, is these so-called cutouts that the GRU used to try to make it less obvious that of its direct role. And so you had the presumed persona Guccifer 2.0, DC Leaks, a website set up by the GRU. But then you had an organization that at least at one time was more independent in terms of WikiLeaks, that was essentially used as the GRU's cutout in this case as well. So what I've been really interested in terms of looking at these issues is trying to figure out why this is happening. I was a high school student at the end of the Cold War. Those were sort of my formative political years. It was easy, I remember then, to know why we were opposed to the Soviet Union, why they were opposed to us. It was communism versus capitalism. Our political systems were vastly different. We had this sort of worldwide competition going on. I feel like myself and a number of other people were perhaps too much asleep at the switch after the end of the Cold War not to realize at what point Russia decided that they were our enemy and that we should be a little more conscious of what they're doing as well. And what their goals seem to be, what seems to be coming out of a lot of these digital operations, and not just against the United States, but many others in the West in particular, is the idea that Russia wants to destabilize Western societies, to undermine confidence in democracy. So even if it can't necessarily overthrow the democracies, to make people less confident in it, to kind of chip away at their sense of security, which can happen with these operations, even if the Ukrainians are able to turn their power stations back on, or get their election system up and running again. If that happens enough, or even if it just happens once, it undermines your sense of security. Or even as we see from the examples of what Russia's social media campaign was trying to do from 2016, well, or even 2015 on through the present, is even just sometimes increasing discord, not even taking a particular side, but just trying to increase the distrust among Americans to kind of tear away at the fabric of our society and others in the West in similar divisive issues. And the candidates that can be favored, because I would say Russia definitely seems to favor some candidates over others, but those can be both on the right and on the left. So that's the famous picture with Michael Flynn, the former national security advisor in the Trump administration briefly, a former director of my former agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and if you had told me back then that a director would be basically a pawn of Vladimir Putin, I would have fallen off my chair. So, but there he was, and there he is right next to him. But then at the same table, you have Jill Stein of the Green Party. So again, kind of both extremes can be, I think, particularly vulnerable to manipulation. I found this quote by a KGB defector from back in the 1980s, but I think it explains well what some of the goals are even now for Russia. The highest art of warfare is not to fight at all, but to subvert anything of value in the country of your enemy until such time that the perception of reality of your enemy is screwed up to such an extent that he does not perceive you as an enemy. You can take your enemy without a single shot being fired. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing now in terms of, even just kind of the undermining of our values. So probably many of us feel like we're seeing that every day. And one thing I've struggled with, and I would gladly welcome any comments from the audience, especially those of you who are Russian specialists, as to how to refer to the ideology of today's modern Russia. Like I said, under communism, it was easy to figure out, easy to study, but it seems to be somewhat more amorphous now. And what you see through Russia's digital operations, I think, is a consistent opposition to Western liberalism, multilateralism, so efforts to weaken NATO, the European Union, even trade agreements, anything that shows the countries, particularly Western or European countries, coming together and strengthening themselves. In opposition to some of the basic freedoms that we cherish, like freedom of press and speech, secularism, the idea that people of different religions can live peacefully together, feminism, LGBTQ rights. These all seem to be hot-button issues that the Russian, official Russia at least tries not just to increase dissension within Western societies, but often really is taking a side toward the more sort of socially conservative aspect of that. My understanding of where Russian political philosophy is right now is that some in Russia refer to this sort of political philosophy as Eurasianism, and again contrasts that to what they see as the more kind of liberal, small L outlook of the West. Also very supportive of nationalist movements in a lot of different countries. And though they probably wouldn't say, yes, we support corruption, in fact, it seems to be that those movements that they support tend to be the more corrupt, partly because the leaders, those in the top of Russian society tend to be rather corrupt themselves, but also because the increase in corruption in Western societies helps to undermine us as well. So with this, and this is another aspect that I think to some extent is overlooked, in that you have Russia's digital operations that are perhaps more ideologically motivated than we typically think, and they do find more natural allies online because of this than is generally recognized. And so particularly Russia's outreach, and this isn't even necessarily just digital, but Russia's outreach over the last 10 or so years to elements of the far right, not only in the United States but in many European countries as well, as sort of natural allies with some of what their political philosophy is. So in that picture, for example, you have David Duke, who many of us, especially older individuals might remember from as a former Klansman, former Republican candidate, congressional candidate, I think from Louisiana, actually has an apartment in Moscow that he sublets at times to other neo-Nazis who come to Russia to visit, which I guess is a steady travel and income source for him. In the picture, he's there with Alexander Dugin, one of the main political philosophers of this sort of Eurasianist movement in Russia. Richard Spencer, who those of us here in Montana know pretty well, has said Russia is the sole white power in the world, and other sort of neo-Nazi white nationalists have made similar statements. They seem to have this odd from my perspective, maybe not theirs, affinity for Russia, particularly Russia under Putin. Spencer's also married to a dual citizen Russian who is a translator for Alexander Dugin and has referred to herself as Putin's number one troll on the internet too. So again, a lot of these cross ties with American white nationalists and Russians. In the Charlottesville demonstrations, the neo-Nazi demonstrators were chanting, among other things, "Russia is our friend." Again, just very odd to me, being so used to Russia being considered from the communist era kind of far left, and then seeing these interactions with the far right. And sort of a cross-pollination of the two ideologies. So this political philosopher of sorts, Alexander Dugin, is a frequent guest on the far-right conspiracy site InfoWars, and individuals like David Duke and other American neo-Nazis are frequent guests on Russian's international channel, Russia Today, now called RT. Even I noticed the Coast Guard Lieutenant Hassan, who was recently arrested for plotting what seems to have been a rather extensive domestic terror plot. His charging documents indicated that in the months as he was preparing his target list, he went thousands of times onto pro-Russian websites, among others. So a lot of overlap between the two. Many of you have probably heard of this individual, again, because we're here in Montana. That picture is of Andrew Anglin, and he runs a website, much more difficult to find these days, called The Daily Stormer, and it's a sort of neo-Nazi website run by himself and another individual, Andrew Auernheimer, who have some rather curious Russian connections of their own. Anglin, the last known address, I should say those of us who've probably heard of him have probably, it's particularly because he is currently being sued by a Montana woman from up in Whitefish. Tanya Gersh is her name, because of some of the attacks that he launched against her and a number of others in Whitefish at the end of 2016. And she's being represented primarily by the Southern Poverty Law Center in that suit. From a legal perspective, very interesting. He tried to argue it was free speech what he was doing, and that has been determined so far not to be the case, to be an exception to that. And one of the issues in that case is that no one could really find Andrew Anglin to serve him. Still a little uncertain where he is, but his last known address appears to have been from Russia, where he sent in his absentee ballot in the 2016 presidential elections. His other sort of co-publisher of the Daily Stormer, Andrew Auernheimer, has basically admitted that he has helped set up kind of like these internet research agency type of kind of troll farms or troll factories, as they're called, people who generate these fake social media accounts and then engage in either attacks against other individuals or trying to change viewpoints. And also what they've done is regularly what's referred to as doxing individuals, putting their their pictures, their home addresses, their social media information, all of that out there, and then encouraging their followers to, as Anglin would say, let them know how you feel, claiming that by doing so they're just expressing their free speech rights, but what almost inevitably happens are death threats and other similar types of hate-filled messages that are very disturbing for the people who receive them. Andrew Anglin's Daily Stormer has also been, the content has been promoted and pushed by Russian-based servers, and when he was in the post-Charlottesville aftermath, taken down by some of the American servers that he was using, also reappeared briefly on a Russian one. He's more sort of on the dark web now, a little harder to find. But what's very interesting is sort of in line with this outreach between or overlap with the far right and these pro-Russian activities is that there's overlap between those sort of troll communities online. And so it turns out, I mentioned Tanya Gersh as one of the individuals up in Whitefish who was targeted. She was not the only one. And some of those others who were able to kind of preserve some of the threatening messages that they received, one thing that I'm working on is a potential case involving that, and we've hired some cyber researchers who've been able to dig into some of those addresses and find that they do appear, in some cases, to have actually come from Russia. So kind of circling back to the GRU attacking those military spouses, they appear to have been sending death threats to people right here in Montana as well, and a number of individuals, I strongly suspect, throughout the United States. So I'll just briefly wrap up. I've hopefully saved enough time for questions. What I'm describing now has not stopped in any way, particularly with the social media. We know Russia's efforts are continuing. Very likely there's still some hacking going on. We just haven't seen the releases yet. If you're curious about what these now better identified kind of Russian social media accounts are pushing, a great resource for this is a website called Hamilton 68. I'd recommend just Googling it because I don't know the exact address. It's under reconstruction right now, but they do a great job kind of tracking on a daily basis what issues these Russian social media accounts are pushing, everything from kind of both sides of a divisive issue to, Devin Nunes's effort to release the memo from a few months back, and it's curious to see who they are supporting at any given time. Some of you may have gone to a talk by an individual named Christian Picciolini, who was here a couple of months ago at the university. He has found a variety of disturbing and very sort of broad-cased Russian not even social media, but cyber efforts to kind of lure people into relationships with these fake persona who are really operated from Russia. For example, Mr. Picciolini himself is a former U.S. neo-Nazi who reformed and now spends a lot of his time helping to de-radicalize others and get them out of the movement. And one of his cases involving that, he found out that this teenage girl who had been radicalized online, thinking that she had this sort of cyber romantic relationship with a young man in Idaho. It wasn't a young man in Idaho at all, but an account that appears to have a number of links to Russia. Similarly, he's found what appear to be Russian accounts infiltrating chat rooms where people with depression or anxiety go, again, more perhaps vulnerable individuals being targeted, and also some online games, again, kind of trying to draw people out and strike up relationships with them. And then there's cybercrime. Again, it could be a topic in and of itself, so I'll just touch on it here. But Russia also has not always officially, a pretty healthy network of kind of cyber-based criminals who seem to be sort of tapped as occasional independent contractors for the GRU from time to time as well. So I think there's certainly an overlap between some of the cyber crimes we see and some official Russian involvement as well. So with that, I'll end. I know you students probably have to be headed out pretty shortly, but if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take those. Yes?
Thanks, Julie. I was struck by how the parent links with the NRA had no legs. It hit the headlines and then quickly disappeared. In your reading, have you seen anything more substantial than the initial report?
Yeah, I think we will be finding out more, particularly because of the arrest and supposedly cooperation of Maria Butina, who was kind of the main liaison, who appears to have been, a sort of Russian spy. It's my understanding that is yet to come out, but I suspect when it does, we'll have a fuller idea of that. Plus, I think her, sort of pseudo-romantic partner, Paul Erickson, I think his name is, has also been indicted, and it's my sense that the purpose of that indictment wasn't just because of the crimes that he committed, but in an effort to get him to divulge more about what was going on with that. So I think it's yet to come. Yes?
Is there any legal way to go after Facebook for spreading Russian propaganda?
It's tricky because a lot of the social media laws are pretty lax. Is what we're finding out. So I think there are efforts to change that, but I suspect there's going to be a lot of pushback from social media companies. What is interesting is that sending threats online, for example, in and of itself is a crime. And so to the extent that Russia could be identified as doing that, there's actually a fairly recent waiver of what would otherwise be their sovereign immunity so that people could sue Russia and any co-conspirators, American or otherwise, who were involved in that effort. So that might be one way, but it is, I think, much harder to go after Facebook or Twitter, for example, though there are a number of cases where people were targeted, they reported them to Facebook or Twitter, because that's contrary to the terms of service, and those organizations didn't act. I think you could see a little more pushback when they weren't abiding by their own terms of service, but my understanding is it's difficult to go after them because the laws were kind of lax to begin with. Yes?
Do you have any suggestions for all generations of Americans who are still, I think, mainly interested in truth, of how we can behave or what questions we can ask to be better informed to get to a better level of understanding?
Yeah, I think, as we learn more, I think we're becoming slowly more savvy as a society. Like I said, that seemed to help the French to some extent to diminish the interference in their elections in 2017, and yet some of that's still going on now, in France and other places. So I think a healthy sense of skepticism, just an awareness that this is happening, especially an awareness that part of the motivation is to get Americans more divided and to some extent try to overcome that. I think our media has a big role to play. If the story in 2016 weren't, hey, this is the latest of what's being shown in Hillary Clinton's emails, and instead was we're under a Russian attack to undermine our election, then I think the perception would have been different and more beneficial for all of us too. Yes.
It seems like there's so much evidence of the interference in the election that I wonder how much evidence would need to be gathered to delegitimize the results of the election, or if something like that could even happen, or what are your...
Yeah, and that's, like we were talking about some of the social media laws not really allowing or not being appropriate for this sort of situation. My understanding of our election laws is they're somewhat similar. You have a relatively narrow period of time to contest the results, and it's not, the sort of contest over issues like this. But I think that's very true, and especially if it persists, then people on both sides will ultimately always feel dissatisfied about the results, and that's part of that whole undermining democracy part that is successful to some extent.
Can our election machines be hacked? Have they been hacked?
And that's a good question, because I realized there was a point that I forgot to highlight that was on one of those slides. Another thing we know about the Russian efforts in 2016 is that in at least about half of the election systems of states, the Russians penetrated the voter rolls, the computers that were holding that, and where that can cause a problem is, eliminating people from those rolls, changing information so that there's more chaos when people are going to vote, and again, undermining the result if people know you're under attack, and then people start to question, what's happening in general. As far as we know, there wasn't any sort of changing of votes or anything like that, and yet we know voting machines can be hacked into relatively easily. One of the, I didn't detail it much, but one of the aspects of the Russian attack on the Ukrainian elections in 2014 was that the Russians had actually gotten into Ukraine's vote reporting computer system, and this is where my lack of computer knowledge is not as helpful in terms of trying to describe this, but the Russian hacking was sort of pushing these false results that would have been obviously false as soon as they came out, again undermining the result. But then the Ukrainian, cyber sort of countermeasures were able to stop it in time, and yet even before, it came out, and it never did officially from the Ukrainian side, curiously, a Russian TV station announced the exact results that were being pushed by the Russians through the Ukrainian system. So that sort of thing can happen. We know the Russians are capable of it, but as far as we know, it hasn't happened in the United States.
Are there any precautionary measures being taken to stop manipulating the election?
Not very widely known. Again, some of you might have seen there was an article in the Washington Post yesterday about how on the day of the midterms in 2018, our own sort of cyber forces basically blacked out the computers of the Internet Research Agency so that they weren't able to do anything. And while it's nice to have that capability, that was just one day. I mean, their social media operations have been ongoing right up until then and continue now. So we don't seem to have an effective response to counter that. I know Congress voted some increased money for election security. There's a lot of controversy about, to what extent are people using that? Are they making good choices with that money? So because we have such a decentralized, state by state election system, it's hard to have a really coordinated effort. I think some people are trying, but I don't think that anyone can say with great assurance that it couldn't happen again. Yeah. Yes?
I was just going to ask, how much of an influence does Russia have over Poland's Peace Party?
That's a great question, because obviously Russia and Poland have a very long history together where just generally they have not gotten along, and that's usually the attitude taken by most Polish parties of any political persuasion, and yet the Peace Party is, and I should say that's P-I-S, not like peace, the happy word, but they are aligned ideologically, I would argue, with a lot of what Russia under Putin is in terms of greater nationalism, greater social conservatism, and there are some individuals, it's my understanding, that do have, maybe like Michael Flynn, some closer than usual ties to Russia. So, I haven't heard of any scandal kind of like we're seeing unfolding in Italy now with some of the parties, or the even the National Front in France actually receiving Russian money or anything like that. But I think they certainly are aligned to some extent on an ideological basis.
I'd be curious if you've seen any social science that might help us understand how the general population feels, whether they know these accusations or they know what's going on as well as you're informing us. And do they generally feel better off? Most of us academics, we're dealing with Russian scholars visiting, we're going over there in academic surroundings, but we don't have these conversations over dinner very often. But how do you think the general population, or the general population of Russia, they feel like they're better off because of these digital attacks?
So you mean the general population in Russia itself? It seems, my sense, and I think this carries significance for the U.S. too, is that as independent sources of Russian media have diminished over the years, the Russian people only believe what they hear. So it would be similar to Americans only getting, say, a very politically biased single news source to, get a sense of what's happening. I know I have heard some Russian dissidents are unhappy to some extent with the way this story has been played in the U.S. and that they feel we're inappropriately kind of boosting up Putin too much. And I can sympathize with that, but I would argue it's important that we understand what's going on, and in a way, it didn't take great skill for the Russians to do this. Like I said, it's kind of a continuation of the sort of thing they've been doing for a while. Arguably, they're more involved in it because it's a sign of weakness. They can't match NATO militarily as well, for example, but they can do kind of like terrorists do these big impact strikes that take, relatively little in terms of means. Unless, I think probably the most effective way to counter some of these activities is, in terms of beefing up our own cyber defenses, but also just taking regular, real-world deterrence action against Russia. Say, we're going to increase the sanctions. You'll be more a pariah country. We will get even closer with our European allies. Look at expanding NATO or that sort of thing, so that they both the Russian leadership and then probably it would drift down to the people, see there's a real negative consequence for engaging in these sorts of activities. Yes?
In the case of Estonia, we see that Russia is capable of disabling the whole country. What's your assessment in terms of the strength of the U.S. defense, cyber defense? Is the U.S. able to prevent or stop that kind of attack?
I think it would be harder in the U.S. to do sort of a countrywide attack just because we're so much bigger. It was relatively easier for Estonia because there were a smaller number of targets, and yet even then the Russians had to rent out servers, various places, including in the U.S., worldwide for that attack. That's part of the reason it only lasted about 10 days because they had only rented them out for so long. So to do something on that scale would be more difficult in the U.S., and yet I think we're just as vulnerable to an attack like that, at least hitting, certain regions of the country or certain systems and networks and that sort of thing. And we haven't thoroughly addressed that. And I know that was part of the concern leading into the 2016 elections, is we knew the Russians had these capabilities. Administration officials at that time were reluctant to do more aggressively for fear that would just escalate some of these cyber attacks and make the situation even worse. So.
Is it your sense that the U.S. is mostly retaliating right now in the real world with economic sanctions and so on, or are we also engaged in cyber attacks reciprocally?
I think we're, to some extent, certainly trying to beef up our cyber defenses, and like the example of our midterm elections, doing that kind of counterattack. In theory, we've introduced some sanctions, but those, are being undermined or slow-rolled, or so we don't. And then we're sending, obviously, very mixed messages to Russia at the same time, some in our government, at least. So it's a much weaker response than I think most administrations would be doing at this point, given what we know of what happened with Russia. Maybe that makes a lot of sense, given what we know of what Russia did. But even what we did, that sort of blackout of the Internet Research Agency on the day of the midterms last year, supposedly was done specifically because they didn't need higher authorization. So it was with the U.S. Cyber Command under the Department of Defense, and they were able kind of to make that decision within themselves. They didn't have to go too far up the chain of command, and a lot of actions that we can take aren't able to be done that way. So.
Because the administration doesn't want to take them?
Presumably, yes. Yes.
So considering Russia is going to, quote unquote, disconnect itself from the internet before August 1st as a way to practice defending against attacks, is there a growing concern that the West might decide, NATO needs to unify and conduct DDoS attacks against Russia as retaliation? Or is it just kind of a defensive measure?
You mean within Russia itself?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we do have some of these capabilities ourselves, but I think Russia has been more adept at kind of putting them into practice, learning from that. So I think what you're describing now is part of their efforts to keep on top of their capabilities, figure out that they, may well see these sorts of counterattacks from us too, and then what's the best way for them to counter it. They seem to or defend against it. They seem to be more on the cutting edge of these types of operations.
Do you think the American people are more susceptible to propaganda than other countries?
Hard to say. Sometimes I like to think that other people are less susceptible, because then I just feel like the world is stronger. But I think other people in other countries are also equally susceptible. I mean, Brexit was a surprise result to many, and that was likely, fueled by the social media campaign there too, and other things that we might be finding out. But I think especially what Russia seems to be doing a good job of, both in the U.S. and then even in its more near abroad, like Estonia, is finding these hot button issues that will make people quickly have strong feelings and kind of feed into this mentality where, like we're seeing even in the U.S., to some extent, even as some people learn of this, if partisanship has increased so much, they're reluctant to really want to do anything about it, because it's, the results have been so intertwined now with individuals' own kind of political persuasions. And I think that is a very sophisticated approach that Russia took. I don't know if they just kind of luckily stumbled into it. It's just part of human psychology that they're able to manipulate. But it's certainly, again, looking at the question of, well, could we have done more in 2016 to avoid the result, knowing that, yes, the Russians wanted Trump to win, but they were also very engaged in what they thought, like the rest of us did, the more likely outcome that Hillary Clinton would be elected, and undermining her legitimacy, making it very difficult for us to take more forceful action for fear that that would be playing right into their hands in that respect. So that's kind of a long answer, but not directly to your point. But yes, I do think worldwide most people are pretty susceptible. Yes?
So with the recent rise in anti-Semitic attacks around Europe, do you think that's mostly due to nationalism of that specific country, or could it have some influence from the Russian fake news, or maybe a combination of the two?
Yeah, I would not be at all surprised. One of the ways that really kind of got me into this topic post-2016 was reading some researchers who were studying social media very intensely even before then, and they noted an overlap in what they referred to as these pro-Russian troll accounts and the sort of neo-Nazi accounts too, that they were often one and the same, going after the same purposes. So I would not be at all surprised if Russian accounts were directly involved in kind of spiking or encouraging, being active with those types of attacks. All right. Well, great. Well, thank you all very much for coming, and hope everyone gets home safely.